If you look at a Friday night in 1994, the first thing you notice isn't the television or what was playing on it. It's what happened before. The drive to a strip mall, the automatic doors, the wall of color that hit you when you walked in, hundreds of boxes lined up on shelves, each one a different promise. New releases along the back wall, familiar titles sorted into genres you half remembered, a staff member rewinding something behind the counter. You had to choose. That was the whole point. And the choosing took time. That store is gone now. You can search the current streaming library of almost any service and find more titles than any video rental store ever stocked, but the experience of walking into one, of standing in front of a shelf and making a decision with your hands is finished. The video rental store didn't fade quietly. It was overtaken 1 year at a time until it existed only as a memory for people old enough to have had a membership card. What happened to the video rental store, and why did it vanish from nearly every town in America? To understand it, you have to start with what the store actually was, not just a retail concept, but an assumption about how people got access to movies. In the years before home video, the options were limited. You could see a film in a theater when it was released, or you could wait for it to appear on television, sometimes years later, and interrupted by commercials. The film itself was not yours to schedule. It aired when it aired. The VCR changed that calculation entirely. By the mid-1980s, V8s had won the format war against Betamax, and recorders were dropping into a price range that ordinary households could reach. The studios, initially hostile to the whole arrangement, gradually accepted that a secondary market existed and began licensing titles for sale and rental. What followed was rapid. By the late 1980s, video rental had expanded into tens of thousands of locations across the country. Dedicated stores, grocery stores, gas stations, and pharmacies all stocking tapes alongside their regular inventory. The store was everywhere because the demand was everywhere. People wanted to watch movies at home, on their own schedule, without waiting for a broadcaster to decide it was time. The independent video store served that need directly. Most were small, a few hundred titles organized loosely, staffed by someone who knew the inventory and was willing to argue about it. The back wall held the new releases. The deeper shelves held everything else. There was a logic to browsing a physical space that a catalog never quite replicated. You went in looking for one thing and came out with something different. That was the assumption the store was built around, that access to a movie required a physical object, and that the object had to be somewhere you could retrieve it. The store existed to hold the inventory and loan it out. It worked for as long as that assumption held. Blockbuster Video opened its first store in Dallas in October 1985. It was not the first video rental concept, but it operated at a different scale from the start. Where independent shops held a few hundred titles in cramped aisles, Blockbuster stocked thousands. Where smaller stores used handwritten systems to track inventory, Blockbuster used barcodes. The store was brightly lit, organized, and designed to move customers efficiently from the door to the counter. The strategy was deliberate. Expand fast, capture market share, and price aggressively enough that independent stores could not keep up. It worked. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Blockbuster opened new locations at a rate that outpaced almost any retail concept of the period. Independent stores closed not because movies stopped being popular, but because the chain next door had more copies of the same titles at lower prices. By the late 1990s, Blockbuster had tens of millions of registered customers across the United States. At its peak in 2004, the company operated more than 9,000 stores worldwide and employed over 84,000 people. The video rental store was no longer a neighborhood experiment. It was an industry. And like most industries built around a single physical format, it was vulnerable to anything that threatened the format itself. Several things happened at once, and their effects compounded in ways that made the rental store's decline feel in retrospect almost inevitable. The first was the late fee. The late fee had always been part of the model. Blockbuster alone collected more than $800 million in late fees in 2000, a figure that sustained the business and quietly generated the resentment that would help end it. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph founded Netflix in 1997. The story most often told about its origins, that Hastings was motivated by a punishing late fee on a rented copy of Apollo 13, may be disputed, but the business model it produced was not. Netflix launched a DVD by mail service in 1998. Subscribers selected titles online, received them in the post, and returned them with no due date and no late fee. In 1999, the company moved to a flat monthly subscription. The rental was no longer a transaction. It was a membership. Blockbuster saw the threat clearly enough to launch its own mail service in 2004 and eliminate late fees in 2005. The response came too late and cost too much. The fee elimination alone was estimated to have cost the company several $100 million in the first year. The debt accumulated during the late 1990s expansion left little room to absorb that kind of loss. The operational weight of thousands of physical stores made every experiment expensive. The second was the internet connection already running into the house. In January 2007, Netflix launched streaming. The initial library held around 1,000 titles, modest by the standards of what the service would eventually become. But the mechanism was new. A subscriber no longer waited for a disc in the post. The movie arrived through a broadband connection, on demand, within seconds of the decision to watch it. The infrastructure that made this possible had been building for years without the rental industry fully registering what it meant. Broadband internet had spread steadily through American households across the 2000s. DVD players had given way to devices that could connect to networks. The television set, once a passive receiver, was becoming a terminal. The rental store had always won on convenience. It was easier than a theater, it was faster than cable, but streaming inverted that advantage entirely. The store required a car, a trip, a choice made standing in an aisle, and a return visit to avoid a fee. Streaming required none of those things. The gap between wanting to watch something and watching it collapsed to almost nothing. And once it did, the premise of driving somewhere to retrieve a physical object became difficult to justify. Redbox arrived at a similar moment with a simpler proposition: a kiosk in a grocery store parking lot, renting DVDs overnight for $1. It did not replace the store, but it absorbed the customer who wanted a physical disc without the membership, the aisles, or the conversation with a staff member. What remained of the rental store's advantages was being compressed from both directions at once. The numbers moved quickly once they started moving. Blockbuster, which had more than 9,000 stores globally at its 2004 peak, began closing locations steadily through the mid-2000s. In 2010, the company filed for bankruptcy. The following year, satellite provider Dish Network acquired the remaining assets for $320 million, a fraction of the valuation the brand had carried just a decade earlier. By 2014, the last company-owned Blockbuster stores were closed. Hollywood Video, the second largest chain, had already collapsed. Movie Gallery, which had acquired Hollywood Video in 2005, filed for bankruptcy in 2010. The independent stores that had survived Blockbuster's expansion in the 1990s were mostly gone by the time the chains fell. The change was not dramatic, it was cumulative. Instead of driving out to choose something from a shelf, you open an app. Instead of a deadline that created a quiet pressure to actually watch the film you rented, you add it to a list and return to it later, or do not. The experience accommodates far more titles and far less effort, but it has shed something in the process. The friction that turned watching a movie into a decision you made with your whole evening. The video rental store assumed that access to a film was worth a trip, that the choosing was part of the experience, that a room full of physical objects, however modest the room, was a better arrangement than a broadcast schedule or a mail-order catalog. The math of changing technology, collapsing late fee revenue, rising debt, and a customer base that no longer needed to leave the house worked against the rental store one variable at a time. No single decision eliminated it. The system around it simply changed until the store no longer made sense within it. You can still find a handful of independent stores if you look, mostly in cities with a film culture dense enough to sustain them, stocking titles that never made it onto streaming platforms. They sit there without ceremony, quietly available, holdovers from an era when seeing a film meant going somewhere to get it. Pull up any streaming service tonight and you will not need one. The store is still out there in a few corners of a few cities in one last Blockbuster in Bend, Oregon that draws tourists now more than it draws Friday night renters. Unassuming, unpretentious, easy to miss. Something built for a version of the weekend that assumed you hadn't already decided what to watch before you left the house. If this brought something back, let me know in the comments. Did you have a regular store? A staff member who knew your taste? A title you only ever found on a shelf you almost walked past? If you found this worth your time, subscribing helps me know there's interest in these topics. The video rental store is still out there if you look hard enough. No algorithm, no autoplay, just a room full of films waiting to be chosen by whoever shows up. It never needed to be more than that.